So last summer, my two sons, Oliver and Dakota, were running around the house yelling at each other, "Come here, boy, and I'll kill you." While they jumped off the couch and swung their white sabers around haphazardly, barely missing each other's heads and other objects in their proximity. I'm still amazed I haven't had to buy a new TV yet. Jamie, of course, was appalled by this phrase that they were using and told him to stop it. Now, normally this doesn't stop anything, but they were compliant this time and they ended using that phrase, at least near us. Later on that evening, while Jamie and I were making supper, we heard the phrase still being used, "Come here, boy, and I'll kill you," as they play, wrestled, and make-believed upstairs. So Jamie and I began a conversation. Where are they getting this language? And Jamie had asked me, do you have any of that language in your video games? Now, one of my favorite pastimes with the kids is we sit down and we play our Nintendo Switch and we go adventuring. And so we have Mario and Zelda. And yes, there are some battles and things like that that's going on, but it's mostly killing bokoblins. And the main protagonist doesn't say a lot except like hiya and let's go. So, there's not a lot of violence towards them. So then we wondered, are they getting it from a YouTube streamer that they watch on some of their video games? However, it's actually very, very G-rated, the ones they can access. So it's kind of a mystery to us where they picked up this particular language. Well, later in the week, it was in the evening, Jamie had sat down, the boys were finally dressed for bed and had their teeth brushed, and they wanted her to read one of their favorite stories from the children's Bible, which is David and Goliath. And as she sat down and read to them, there was this phrase that was uttered by Goliath towards David, "Come here, boy, and I'll kill you." Now, Jamie read right over it without any hesitation, not even thinking about it, and I burst out laughing. When she asked what was so hilarious, I said, "It's the Bible. That's where they're getting the violent phrase." And she said, "Oh, well, how do I change that phrase?" I was like, "Well, don't go biblical because it's a lot worse." But it got me thinking, and I actually did a Sunday school on this one time in Arizona. Kids' stories in the Bible aren't so kid-friendly, right? Jonah and the whale, man gets swallowed by a whale, spit out in the desert. Some of these things actually have violent images, but we have that since the beginning. We are taught from early ages about power and battle and death and overcoming your enemies. It's a very common motif. I mean, very early on, many of us have heard the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, right? David and Goliath. These stories permeate throughout our culture. The David and Goliath story is so common that we hear it regularly without any context. If you're any fan of any sports, you always hear about the David and Goliath matches. David, the young startup, the underdog who comes and they defeat the champion. And in our story today, one thing is very clear. Goliath is the champion. Now, this idea of kind of trotting out two warriors to face each other in individual battle is actually very common during this time period. War is expensive. It's expensive to keep armies upkept. It's expensive to have new materials. So rather than waste their resources on the battles fighting each other, oftentimes they would come together, choose their particular champion, they would fight each other, and then the loser would agree to a certain terms of agreement. And then next year they would come meet again. So the Israelites are trying to figure out who's going to face this champion, and they were delaying their choice in order to strategize. Now, this is a problem to our modern mindset because it's a strange scene. We don't do this in our modern military mindset. We don't have armies continually march out during the springtime to war. Winning the battle for these armies meant peace and security for another year. And Saul has a pretty superior force, but he doesn't have that champion. And this is a problem for Saul because he doesn't want to negotiate with the Philistines, times, he wants to beat them so that he doesn't have to agree to these lower terms. So Saul needs to save face when David arrives and demands that he is going to be selected to take on Goliath. But Saul has to dress him properly, because you just can't send anyone out there to face this champion. You need to have the finest dressed person, the most hardened military person. And so they put on David all the best armor to make him look impressive out in the field. Because those are the hardened military men. At the other end were these peasant slingers. The slingshot was a very common weapon in military during the ancient times. Many of them used them. Of course, most of it was from the peasantry who couldn't afford the more expensive armor or the more powerful weapons. So letting David go out there and face Goliath looking like a peasant slinger was just about one of the most humiliating things that Saul could do for his army or for his kingdom. Even by sending David to face Goliath with a slingshot would have said that the best that I could muster is a peasant boy. And so it would have been very humiliating for him. And yet, here's David, a simple peasant shepherd with his slingshot to take on Goliath. And the statement he makes about God is also not very unusual for this time. Many people would have dedicated their victories to a god or to the gods, and so oftentimes these battles were seen as a way to which God is more powerful. Moving over to our gospel message, we're also dealing with a power. The power here is the power of nature and the storm that rages upon the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and his disciples have been preaching all day to the masses through parables, and Jesus tells his disciples, let's cross over the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus and his disciples are out in the middle of Galilee when a storm arises. And when this storm arises, it not only threatens to sink the boat, but it also threatens to kill all those who are there. But Jesus is very unconcerned about this, as our biblical message today says that Jesus is sleeping on a cushion. Why a cushion? I actually don't know. I actually tried to read about this, but none of the commentaries gave a very clear answer, and some were quite speculative in nature. For me personally, I remember Dad napping on a pillow, and what it brings in my image is that Jesus was so exhausted, he could literally sleep in a boat on a small pillow while the waves were crushing over him. So I don't want to focus too much on the pillow in and of itself, but I want to focus on the fact that storms are a sign of the gods. Storms for centuries have been attributed to particular gods and God's angers or God's frustration. So oftentimes when a storm or natural disaster hit, it was attributed that some god had brought this upon them. And of course, so the disciples want to wake Jesus up, and they want to have him battle this storm, or they want to have this power on display. So really what we're talking about in this passage is very similar to the David and Goliath story. Jesus is facing another god. Jesus is facing the storm, the waves, the wind, the lightning, the thunder. And what we are anticipating is the answer of the question, who is more powerful, or which one is more powerful? So let's connect these two scenes together. One, both Jesus and David are faced with significant opposition. Both of them seem very calm in the face of what could be a catastrophe. Both of these stories have the larger motif of powers, two powers that seem insurmountable. Ever been on a small boat in a storm in the middle of a lake? Have you ever been in the middle where you feel very vulnerable? What can David do in the face of Goliath? What can Jesus do in the face of a storm? And yet when both stories end, it is not the powerful that are standing, but it is the young boy with the slingshot, and it is Jesus who just recently was napping on a cushion. In June 15, 2014, It was Father's Day, and it would happen to be the last time that I talked with my own father. I had called him to wish him a happy Father's Day and let him know how the job search was going. You see, I had just recently been laid off from my teaching position due to budget cuts and was having very little luck finding another job, which was a large distress in Jamie and my life at that time, simply because she was going to graduate school, finishing her doctorate, and so I was the primary earner during that time for benefits and money. I wasn't very chatty with Dad that day. Part of the reason because I wasn't feeling very good about where my life was and didn't feel like he should be very proud of me at that moment. But another reason was because we had made the decision that we were coming home in 2 weeks to see everyone. All the family was congregating back in South Dakota. Unfortunately, Dad had heart issues, and while he was switching medications and he was out working, preparing for the arrival of us, he was tired, and so he said to his brother as he was tiling a floor, he said, I'm kind of tired, I want to lay down. And it was there that his heart just stopped working. I remember getting the call while driving back from South Dakota. And for everything else that was going on in my life, it just felt like another wave of a storm that crashed over me. Now, this is the part of the story that I'm supposed to tell you that we went out and slew Goliath. This is the part of the story where I said that Jesus is supposed to rise up and calm the waves. But unfortunately, the Christian story doesn't always end like that. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. Because here's the thing about Christianity. A lot of times it feels, as an individual, as a community, that we are like David and Goliath in the battle, or that we are in the middle of a storm. And if you're here today because you love winning, you love being on top, if you love power, that's just not the story of Christianity. Christianity, very few times in this world, has been in the center of power, has been in those positions to make the decision or overcome or conquer. Most times what we hear about with God and the Israelites and Christians is working from the margins, working for those people who are dispossessed, working in those places where the power is most absent. And that doesn't mean that there aren't great victories. That doesn't mean that Christ doesn't overcome and that God doesn't break in and that we don't conquer in those particular time periods. But I would say for most of us, our experience is of the storm and reaching out to God and crying out to God. And so the Christian experience is about how we find strength in the midst of those sufferings, how we work together to stand together in community, and we with Christ shout in the face of that storm that we will not lose heart, that we will not let the waves overcome us, that we will not succumb to those who are powerful. And so as a Christian community, we stand in solidarity with each other and continue to fight, even when the odds are against us, even when the world, like Goliath, is laughing at our meager contributions or meager attempts with a slingshot. So when the world calls for punishment, we stand and call for grace and forgiveness. When the world desires war, we gather together to pray for peace. When the world is bent towards injustice, we as Christians stand up and practice justice and righteousness. When the world practices exclusiveness, we as Christians welcome people into the heart of God and Christ. We stand together as a community of believers to face the storm together. And I think that that is our David and Jesus moment, in that we come together as Christians and we face the insurmountable, oftentimes in our daily lives. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.